Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar screening and the Q&A session afterwards, where we will dive deeper into Liu Guofu's artistic practice and the theme behind In Praise of Blandness, the artist's solo exhibition that is currently on show at our London gallery. I'm Calvin Hui, co-founder of 3812 Gallery and exhibition curator. I'm much delighted to be joined by Dr. Malcolm McNeil, Director of SOAS Postgraduate Diploma in Asian Art and Senior Lecturer in Art Education, and Dr. Joshua Gong, Research Editor of Unicorn Publishing and leading experts on Chinese contemporary art. While watching the webinar, please feel free to share your questions in the Zoom chat feature, and we will address them to the panelists in the Q&A session afterwards. So now we hope you all enjoy the screening. Joshua, as the artist suggested the title In Praise of Blandness for his latest solo exhibition, what do you think or how you interpret the theme?
Okay, thank you, Calvin. I was very much inspired by the artist, but before I saw his work, then I have this feeling, but I can't explain it in a legible way. It's something ineffable. I can't explain, but I can feel it. There's very deep Chinese, ancient traditional Chinese way, especially the literati way of observing the relationship between the individual and the society, as well as between nature and the culture. So in Chinese cultural concept, we do not distinguish too much or make it as a dichotomy, saying nature versus society or culture. And when I view Guofu's painting, I can see is trying to blur the boundary between those two very distinct fields, especially being developed in modern Western society after the 18th century. Then I was in contact with artists discussing his work, and he suggests there is a book by a French sinologist and philosopher, François Julian, Élodie de la Fête Dieu, which is In Praise of Blandness. I think the philosopher, he himself captured the essence of this Chinese spirit, while Guofu's visual language represents such a feeling, and it served as an open discussion for us to understand this is not just some unique Chinese concept or approach or Chinese way, but also it's a universal. It just during the development of our society, especially in the industrial one, this kind of idea has been eclipsed by positivism or materialism at a point. But now we are in the 21st century, then the world is very deeply linked and globalized. So this is something we shared by all communities and societies with different cultural backgrounds and national identities. But we can recognize it because we are in a globalized human society. So I think he articulated, or this notion is very suggestive, while it can help us to understand his artistic invention in this particular area. So Guofu, he emphasized that he wanted to share with his audience and collectors that he focused on how to paint rather than what to paint. In this case, we, as audience, we try to read or appreciate his work by knowing how rather than what to expect from the surface. So that's what I thought when I was trying to comprehend his work, especially the emotion being conveyed from the surface so that I can feel something deep and try to elaborate a little bit further. But our audience or everyone who see Guofu's art shouldn't be limited by my view. I'm just trying to give us a cue to understand, a method to approach, rather than a narrowed view saying this is how we do it.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Yeah. Well, I also found Blandness, this term, very interesting, especially when I started to work with Liu Guofu since 2012. And I remember the first time I saw Liu Guofu's work is in 2011, when I visited in Beijing, Shanghai, and Nanjing. And I do appreciate the word blandness because the subtlety from Liu Guofu's painting actually delivers such sense and also the aesthetics. Also, I remember Dr. Jia Kejun once said Liu Guofu's painting is like infusion of light and qi. So we Chinese always talk about qi, but it's about the energy and also very atmospheric. It's something like the light with air. So while light brings out its depth, air helps disperse the light to every corner of Liu Guofu's work. And also the colors, the iconic blue-grayish color Liu Guofu used is actually very calming, but then it could also be very dynamic. Especially in the last 2 years when I saw Liu Guofu's works began to evolve, and from very subtle to you could see a very dynamic brushstrokes. I definitely want to share or discuss with you both how you see this blandness, how you interpret this blandness to you when you see Liu Guofu's painting. Like Malcolm, do you have
thank you. Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, I think they're wonderful works. They're works that I've spent a small amount of time with, but the time was very memorable. They're extremely compelling. And I was really struck both in your comments and in Joshua's comments by the way you both focus in on the kind of the emotional impact of these paintings, of these canvases. These are something that, draw you in, they require your attention, and they're quite immersive and impactful. They're not immediately legible. Again, they don't translate into kind of iconographies or particular structured forms. They imply them, in the series, this latest series, rocks, flowers, these are very explicit iconographic subjects. We know what this is on a certain level because we've been told it by the artist. We have this voice of absolute authority that tells us this is a rock, this is a flower. But yet the way that we respond to it is so different from, say, other contemporary artists like Liu Dan, who paint these sort of almost hyper-realist ink paintings of scholars' rocks. This is something profoundly different from that. And that's partly, I think, down to media, partly down to the artist's sentiment. And if we're to circle back to this title that you've applied to the exhibition that the artist came up with himself, which I was first, as a side note, absolutely fascinated to hear. It comes from a French sinological text. I mean, that slightly blew my mind because, this concept to me, it pulled me into very different areas of thinking than 18th century French scholarship or 19th century French scholarship on China. So in short, I think, yes, this blandness, as you put it, Dan in Chinese. When I was preparing for this discussion and doing a bit more background research on the artist, the places I was going to were not a reaction to the empiricism of the 18th century. It wasn't about kind of getting beyond the scientific optical perspective, our predilection to look closely and assume we understand things because we can perceive them. That trusting our vision in a way. It was much more of a kind of desire in preparing for this discussion to go and look at much older texts. And in fact, it was the very text that got me into the study of Chinese culture in the first place, the Dao De Jing, that I went back to. And particularly in verse 35, I think there is kind of injunctions that talk about this ineffable way, this ineffable Dao as being Dan, as being bland, as being... And that's where the term starts to unravel for me, and the difficulty of translation, whether from French to Chinese or Chinese back to English or where we find it, that this core concept at the center of this really compelling exhibition is as ineffable as the paintings themselves, that it carries with it so many different implications that we can talk them round in circles and circles here, but of course the thing you all have to do is to go to either 3812's website or to their galleries and see these paintings in person, to have this experience. But that blandness, as we might call it, or perhaps dilution, or even dissolution, it describes a kind of, at its root, it's the reduction of the concentration of something, and it sort of sits somewhere between dilution, but also by implication in Liu's work, in distillation. So I guess in a very convoluted way, what I'm trying to say here is that these works, as Joshua put much more eloquently than I have, and Calvin underscored, are so emotionally affecting that while the title actually did cause me to kind of raise an eyebrow the first time I heard it, why would you call an exhibition centered on blandness? Is that very tongue-in-cheek, or is this something, whereas actually it's speaking to something that requires our attention. And when you're in front of it, something that compels our attention, that pulls you in. And it pulls you in with this kind of subtle simplicity of color and light and structure and form that is breaking down kind of complex structures, whether they be rocks, whether they be flowers, whether they be landscapes, whatever form Liu has kind of turned his brush to, that instead pull you into these immersive pictorial spaces that are actually kind of also subtly three-dimensional, because they're oil paintings. There's a sense of light and form and volume, but also texture there. So I think for me, it's that emotional affect that they have when we encounter the paintings that makes this title, this idea of blandness, initially one that I was slightly kind of raising an eyebrow at, then thinking, well, okay, maybe this is drawing from ancient Taoist philosophy. Now I have to rethink my thinking, because it's actually situated in the artist's understanding of a much more complicated, much more international way of thinking about the concept. But fundamentally, it's about our immersive emotional experience in these dilute, but also pure spaces that we're kind of pulled into. All three of us have them as backgrounds to our presentation just now, these three different series of the artists that we can see in this discussion that provide very different kinds of emotional impacts, but equally pull us into these spaces that require us to kind of look and linger and stay. And that's my response to it. I think to really echo that, but think about dilution and allowing yourself to be absorbed into that dilute space is one of the things I find so compelling and so arresting about the artist's work.
I actually want to add one more point about the blandness. To me, it's more like an emotional state of the artist himself. It's also something about the quality of the aesthetics from our tradition. Joshua mentioned about the literary. Is the moment that I found Liu Guofu may also embrace that spirit and that quality to show his emotion and also his humanistic concern through his paintings. That's why I would see from the emotional perspective, no matter how dynamic or how strong the brushstroke or how fermented, and then this blandness is always with the artist, as this is the artist's quality, very sophisticated, very elegant. It's very long-lasting, aftertaste, eternal. That's how I feel. But when we see the artist, when he used very chaotic brushstrokes, very fermented, Joshua, I think you also have a different interpretation when you see these brushstrokes and the texture of the canvas. So you introduced the term entropy, right? So how do you come up with this term? Yeah.
There are several concerns why I come up with this term, because I was thinking how to summarize Guofu's looks like simple but very sophisticated visual representation. Because when I look at his image or painting, color field, I can see it's very calming, but it's not fixed. It's moving. So visually, you can feel it's very slow motion movement there. And it's very similar to Leonardo da Vinci when he painted the water, while he trying to understand water, then trying to slow it down to observe the movement. And I was thinking it must have something to do with energy or the way we understand how the universe moves. And then I think about the very original or very beginning of the inquiry about the universe, how it moves. Then entropy is something I think is suitable because we have an artist as a thinker or mediator who pull the information, perceive the vast information into his brain. Then he digests, then trying to find a simple way to show us what it's like, then transformed from his thoughts to his hand, then worked it out. And I think this is in part is something to do with counter entropy effect, because entropy suggests chaos. We need to, in order to maintain the order or to make ourselves comfortable, we have to do something. Then, even though as audience, we see it's very calming, but I can see the artist struggle when we think about it, how he tried to do something new, while in contemporary art field, there's so many of them, so many intellectual artists working on this field, trying to understand, to present the so-called the truth of our life. Now it is not easy. Then in order to make such inquiry, while not only just breaking the rules, but also to give a suggestive or constructive solution itself is not easy. So I think entropy itself is in part very associated with what he was doing. Secondly, I think also talk about engagement, especially with Western ones. I think science is something we can agree upon from both Chinese and Western intellectual circles. When we especially at the very beginning of the 20th century, when Chinese trying to reinvent the national culture, they think science is very important. But to understand science, not just narrowly focus on science, but how science going to complement our way of understanding humanity, that's more important. I think entropy itself is not just it arises from the field of physics, but it has much wider meaning. Eventually, it suggests how we understand organic or let's say biology in a wide scope. I think that's the reason why I particularly selected this concept, not only for us to understand, but it is also very appropriate in interpreting and explaining Guofu's art. So we could have a very contemporary while solid understanding about his work.
But then, Joshua, will you compare entropy and blandness? Because it seems like two different concepts. Are they conflicting or are they complementing? I mean, in this context with Liu Guofu's paintings.
I think it's complementing rather than a high contrast, because I think the reason why Chinese society or Chinese intellectuals, they can have this blandness is, first of all, they admit there's entropy. There's something out of our control, while we still try to make it, make the relationship harmonious, even though we admit there is something not harmonious there. The understanding itself, some of the things they are, let's say the physical or the external world is not exactly at your disposal, not entirely at your disposal. But you can try to position yourself into this slot that both you and the inner world and the external world feel happy or feel less struggling, which also represents in his on the canvas from Guofu. When you look at it, you feel yourself calm down. It's not because the external world or our metropolis is calmed down by itself, they still work on their own way. And individually, we might seem very insignificant in a vast society. To put it that way, if I die today, the world still moves. So it doesn't matter. But I think the idea of admitting this and try to understand and to live this way, because you realize the truth of the harsh world, while you still feel happy to live on. That is a great will to this life or to this surrounding, while blandness is something to do with that, because when you admit it, you feel less anxious. You feel less struggled because you already know what's going to happen. The only thing you need to do is try to live with it, find the best way to enjoy, to find the truthful meaning of this life, while filtering those chaotic or not so useful information. Information by information, it could be visual, could be verbal, could be audio, something like that. So I think those two concepts, they do complement each other once we know the philosophy behind it.
Yeah, and yeah. Malcolm.
Yeah, Joshua, I love that comment, and I also that kind of your quite frank comment of an entropic, conceiving of modern society as a system with entropy operating in it, and also that quite candid comment of if I die today, the world continues moving. Those, I mean, that makes me think about, or it prompts me to think about, how I think about entropy, and then to come back to Leo Guofu's work. But at least my very basic understanding of the concept is that entropy is a law of thermodynamics, that it refers to energy contained within any contained system, whether that system be an experiment, whether that system be a city, as you describe it, whether that system be modern human civilization, or that system be the entire kind of universe in which we exist, that everything in that is tending towards a stable state of the minimum complexity, that everything tends towards what you describe as disorder. But I think in some senses it's only disorder when we center human experience within it, when we center this kind of idea that we as thinking, cognate combinations of molecules and things are the kind of the principle around which the universe is ordered, because it is the principle around which we order everything. We center ourselves in what we do and center humanity. But I mean, this seems quite convoluted, but bear with me for a minute, because I think, to come back to Calvin's question about where does entropy, where does this kind of collapsing of order into the most simple possible arrangement relate to blandness, relate to the dilution of, well, literally kind of in the Chinese term, the dilution of a liquid to a very kind of dilute state. Where do those connect? And in again, those kind of, perhaps where I was overreaching in researching this topic, to go back to those early Taoist texts, this idea of the Hundun, the kind of the primordial chaos from which all things emerge in classical Chinese philosophy, is remarkably similar in my very naive understanding of both early Taoist philosophy and of thermodynamics, that this kind of tendency towards chaos has a parallel there. So at a conceptual level, there's that linkage, but where does that connect to the artist's work? And for me, there's this difference that on one level, if I really try and think about what entropy means and apply it to myself, I am utterly terrified. Like I find that notion that everything is tending towards kind of it's completely blows my mind. And it fills me with fear because of the vanity of my own desire as a human being to continue my own existence, and the idea that I and everything I know and everything I could know and could understand will eventually collapse to the most simple arrangement of molecules is terrifying. Or not even molecules of neutrons, protons, and electrons, whatever that may be. Again, I don't really get this stuff. But when we come to Leo Guofu's painting, when we look at that simplicity, that blandness, which does have a conceptual link to that concept, the emotional impact is the inverse of that. That in looking into one of these rocks, these flowers, these pervasions, as he describes, and the kind of diffuse surfaces of color and line and form, which I think we are going to talk a bit more about in a moment, they impact me in such a different way. And again, it comes back to that kind of willingness to let go of vanity in a way. Through immersing yourself in this sensory experience, they tend to pull you away, or I can only really speak for myself here. They pull me away from my anxieties, from my sort of cognitive worries. I cease to worry about the practicalities of my life, finance, childcare, professional advancement, the things that I have to do in a day. They start to kind of fade away the more time I spend with one of these paintings, because they are these, and I want to say distilled, but in fact they're dilute in a way. They're not kind of concentrating something. Instead, they're allowing the superfluous to be removed and bringing it down to
the wave, let's say.
Yeah, this kind of flattening of formal structures, of whether they be petals or porous surfaces of a limestone rock. They blur around the edges, quite literally. We look at the painting behind Calvin.
Yeah, I think it's something to do with our scope. If you have a bigger vision, those high dynamic range becomes nuanced. That's why I think the flat surface the artist is trying to do, or use his energy, he was ahead of us to find a method which is hidden on the surface. Immediately, you won't feel it. You feel your engagement with the work rather than thinking about the artist's effort. But because I was talking to the artist, I was asking him how you achieved such an effect. And he said it's anti-entropy in this way, because he was anxious in terms of his own artistic invention.
Well, the whole process Liu Guofu has been going through is about risk-taking. Every brushstroke could be a risk-taking approach. And it is also a lot of uncertainties on the canvas that the artists have to tackle. And eventually he found a balance. And this artist is really an interesting guy, especially working so closely with him. And he would never finish a painting, he said, until the point that, hey, I have to really pick the painting, deliver to London, we have to stop. But then he can continue to deconstruct and reconstruct, and then to deliver this. I think the whole process, I think the artist also trying to be challenging himself, and also a process of very meditative to break through all this risk and uncertainty. And it creates such chaotic beauty that attracts so many different viewers, no matter you're from which backgrounds. I remember in the exhibitions that we organized in a gallery, or in recently in Masterpiece, and a lot of viewers or collectors, they haven't heard of Liu Guofu's name, but then they were attracted by the painting, and they also found the type of internal connection when they stand in front of the paintings. I found at this point, it is the value, the universal value that the artist actually sharing with the world. That's very, very contemporary, because, sometimes this artist is a very subtle person. He tried to deliver his emotion, no matter anger, anxiety, happiness. All this emotion actually converted into brushstrokes and then put it in the paintings. And this is also some kind of status quo of how Chinese people living nowadays. They try not to really express too expressive, but they try to be a bit subtle to deliver the emotion. So that's why I found, on one hand, this is this abstract painting to be very universal in terms of aesthetic appreciation, but at the same time, it's also something that really relates to Liu Guofu's own cultural background.
I think Guofu's his images, it has huge capacity. It's organic in a way, because you can see it's growing, but you can't describe it, whether it's heavily influenced by Western art or heavily influenced by Chinese art. It's heavily influenced by whole art, let's say, by both, because we now learn everything, or we are not constrained by specific timeline, because we
how you both appreciate or interpret the Asian or Chinese aesthetic qualities through Liu Guofu's art in a more like historical or cultural context. Do you think Liu Guofu's painting or his brushstrokes and the way he tried to project or suggest an image actually influenced by Chinese Asian paintings?
I mean, for me, I don't see Chineseness in Liu Guofu's work. I mean, I'm aware of it. I'm aware of it because I know of the artist's biography. Encountering it in your gallery in St. James's and your stand in Masterpiece, Calvin, it feels like there's a context that tells me this is there. And I suppose in some of them, with the title rock, and then some of the images that have these kind of, the Ningshi, the kind of scholar's rock, these forms, they have an implication attached to them. But no, they don't read to me. They don't immediately have a kind of legibility as Chineseness. There's a conceptual richness underneath there that we've discussed at length about this kind of nuanced take on it. And I think I suppose perhaps there's a distinctive, I wouldn't want to say Chinese approach or Asian approach. I'd say a distinctive Liu Guofu take on responding to the borders of abstraction. And as Joshua has said, a kind of a particular take on what postmodernism can do. And I appreciate it can be quite an overly intellectualized term that can turn people off sometimes. But fundamentally, I think Joshua put it so well in saying this is asking, not telling. And this is prompting us to ask questions. There's an openness to how we respond to these works, which I think is facilitated by the way that Liu Guofu very delicately treads that line between kind of these historical precedents that we've been hearing about, these rich concepts that he's developed over his career. But no, to answer your question very directly, Calvin, I don't experience him as a kind of fundamentally Asian artist. And I think actually at the core of that is maybe my own sort of habitual response to kind of look for the brushstroke and to look for things, having spent several years in kind of the art market, looking at more traditional paintings, that kind of legibility of the mark and that ability to kind of trace and recreate the process of construction. Perhaps it's because I'm less familiar with oil, but certainly I can't do that so readily in Liu Guofu's painting. And I think that in a sense is a very different take. I mean, I think maybe Joshua can say much more about where this sits in a kind of a lineage of Asian modernisms or Asian modernism, or perhaps he has another take, another response to Calvin's prompt.
I think Malcolm suggests something very well. I very much appreciate. Yes, we can say there's not immediate or apparent Chineseness into it, because in my opinion, it's because he didn't specifically copy any iconography, but he grasped the essence of Chinese aesthetics. But those aesthetics, we can use a phenomenological term, saying we understand the intention behind image making. And the ancient Chinese people already raised it, but it's not specifically Chinese, it's universal. It just later on, there are specific representation projects those ideas, and we think it's Chinese. But fundamentally, we understand what they are. Then Guofu had been thinking deeply. He reinvented this because he doesn't want to copy. Then also, that kind of copying or studying the methods or patterns is specifically the issues low Chinese art done, because you can see repetitions all the time, especially in the late official recognized Siwang, let's say, those kind of art. I'm not saying they are bad. I'm just saying fundamentally, systematically, they do not have too much constructive suggestions. But in order to make something new, you need to go back to the very origin of thinking about it. Recently, I've been reading Zhu Qingshen's work. He's writing about different systems. I think he suggested that the Chinese way and the Western way, they kind of split into separate way in the 13th century, Giotto and Nizan. They both spread in a certain way. Nizan focused on calligraphy or Shufa, and Giotto more of a representational image. But before that, it's still very much not distinctive. It's still universal. So in terms of gene, let's talk about it like a gene. We have it. Some of the genes are not apparent, but they are still there. But now we try to make them reserve again. Then Guofu's one, we can see because I'm Chinese, I'm embedded with this cultural burden or inertia. So I can see the Chineseness there. But I think it's not necessary for Westerners to think, oh, I have to understand in a Chinese way. No, we think it's very much a universal feeling of it. Everyone can comprehend or get something from or the energy from the surface. And that's how I think Guofu in a way achieved what he wants to do, something with great capacity and also with a very simplistic presentation for you, for audience to get into this vastness.
To end this webinar, I want to quote Guofu's saying, "Each person's brushstrokes are the traces they leave in the world."
Thank you, Calvin, Malcolm, and Joshua. That was obviously pre-recorded, but what we're going to do now is to share with all of the audience our questions that have been submitted. So yeah, thank you very much, all of you. I shall start with a question from Natalie, who has asked, this interpretation of blandness seems very different to what she had previously understood. So could you explain more about this notion of blandness and how it differs from sort of maybe a Western perspective to an Eastern perspective? And I think that would probably be to sort of maybe Joshua and Malcolm. Feel free to.
Joshua, after you.
Okay, I will start. I think blandness, maybe according to my conversation with different Westerners, they feel it's less interesting. But the question itself is interesting. While I try to explain it simply, maybe we can make a comparison with food. So Western food and Chinese food, or the high culture food, sometimes or Japanese high culture food, they are concentrated on the original taste of the material rather than adding salt, sugar to stimulate the flavor. I think the blindness in this is to get to the truthfulness of life, to get everything, the daily life, to recognize the beauty rather than to think, in this life I need this and that, have this desire that cannot be obtained just because our response to the external world is limited by our nerve system. While if we try to recognize this external truthfulness of everything is daily and we like this world, then we can reach a state of being eternal. That makes sense. Sorry.
Yeah, I think if I were to answer that, I might approach the question slightly differently. I have, as a kind of university academic, where everyone is kind of driven by postmodern ways of thinking, taking a massive East and a massive West on one side and the other side makes me a little bit uncomfortable. But I would say that there's a substantial difference in the implications of the words that are used in the Chinese and English titles of this exhibition. And that comes down to kind of the nuts and bolts of translation on a certain level. So I think as Joshua was describing very eloquently with that food analogy, which I wish I had that analogy, I wish I could have had that one. But I think if we're just to think about kind of what the people walking past 381.2 and St. James's are going to think when they read that text on the window, what do we associate with blandness? I mean, for me, blandness in English has a very pejorative tone to it.
it comes with it carries with it a meaning that something bland is lacking in vibrancy, lacking in flavor, lacking in substance even. Whereas the Dan, as we discussed, perhaps at greater length and was well, at very great length anyway in the webinar, has multiple meanings attached to it. And without getting into the kind of the way you might link it to Taoist philosophy or one way of thinking or another, quite on a purely linguistic level, that phrase Dan is a bit more neutral, and perhaps even can be seen as a kind of celebratory term. It's kind of a eulogy to simplicity, or in praise of simplicity, or the kind of even the song of simplicity is one way you could quite creatively translate the title, the Chinese title of this exhibition. So I think there is a different set of implications in the terms, and that comes out if you're thinking about the cultural context in which these terms are circulating. But it's at the core of what 3812 are doing in bringing artists and their works from most of the kind of Greater China region, from East Asia, and presenting them to UK audiences who may not be so familiar with these concepts, but certainly can kind of access them and begin to kind of process them through the works themselves. So that's my response, I guess, here. It's an issue of translation to some extent, and a reception of these terms. They don't naturally marry onto one another. But I think Joshua's analogy of food is the best explanation of our.
I think if I were to talk about art, sorry, I forgot about that at the point. We can compare the art in the Tang Dynasty and the Song Dynasty, the difference between them. In the Song Dynasty, the aesthetics is very subtle. They have simple color. And Tang Dynasty, they try to be majestic. And I think the Chinese culture, because it's longevity, we're seeing up and downs, and we see the society of the spectacle, and also we see the decline. So in a way, you try to think, oh, what's supposed to be the normal way? What's supposed to be the secret of Chinese culture, the longevity of it? I think it's the way to appreciate daily life, to make everything simpler, to make everything subtle. What is subtle is what is eternal. That's our highest aesthetic philosophy or aesthetic conception. So we try to not distance from nature. We try to be close to nature, to be close to the a spiritual harbor. Then in order to do that, you need to appreciate the blandness, let's say.
Well, when we prepared this exhibition, I also asked about Liu Guofu's perspective on Blandness. Actually, he shared with me several lines, which I felt very special. That's why we also put these lines in the exhibition catalog. So maybe I can share one or two. So Blandness is the starting point of all things, is the existence of uncertainty and infinite change that is constantly updated. Blandness is the expression of things that cannot be expressed and of existence that are ready to disappear. And there's another line, blandness is the path towards emptiness. So you can see actually it's more in the spiritual side. And this spiritual side also more linked with what we learn or experience in terms of like Taoism or even Buddhist philosophy. Yeah.
And also, I think something to do with Liu Guofu's personal experience, because he's a witness of the rise and some tumbling experience of contemporary Chinese art or modernization of Chinese art. So he's seen the 2008, the peak at the point of the market. There are so many various different kinds of artwork. Some of them are superficial, some of them are subtle. I think he's trying to find a solution to demonstrate his personal experience, that it's valuable. People can recognize from the future. It still has validation to justify the new Chinese way in a globalized culture.
Excellent, thank you. So the next question we have is sort of delves into this comparison between entropy and blandness again. So Florence's question is, entropy and blandness, you mentioned that they complement each other, but actually is it actually that blandness is the final goal after the process of entropy? So in Liu Guofu's work, is the progress of how he creates his artworks, blandness, and the feeling at the end. Yeah, blandness is the feeling that's there present in the end. What do you think about that?
Me or me
Yeah.
answering? Yeah, I think the audience raised a very interesting question, and she was absolutely right. Then if we try to distinguish between the means and the ends, then entropy supposed to be the means and anti-entropy is the means, then the end will be blandness. Meanwhile, I have to articulate that in terms visual art, we have two concepts. One is the philosophy of art, right? Another is the technique or skills of art. Both of them are important because without the philosophy of art, your work, no matter how skillful, you are still craftsmanship. Without the masterful skills to project your idea, no matter how deep your philosophy is, you cannot achieve and realize in the visual culture. So both of them are important. One is the philosophy, which we can say it's the blandness Liu Guofu is trying to achieve. Another is the technique, the anti-entropy effect he made through the abstract patterns and the subtlety of it, and the smoothness and translucent color he's trying to achieve by oil painting, while the aura derived from ink painting, he tried to put them together and make a new color field. It would justify his artistic value.
I think it's a really interesting question that you posed to us, Florence. So thank you very much for that. And I was really interested in the discussion, kind of listening back to it just now, in Calvin's kind of way he reorientated Joshua and I back towards the artist's own experience of making the work. So I think there is this, if we're talking about where do we relate this kind of this affect or kind of this impact of the painting on ourselves, this blandness or dan, this emotional state that the works give us some kind of access to. Calvin reminded us in a really interesting way to think about kind of perhaps the technical process we can think of as entropy, the breaking down of forms, but that idea, that concept, picked by the artist himself, was something that underpins his creative practice. This idea that its blandness is moving towards nothingness, a Buddhist notion of the kind of associated with a void, but also awakening. So I'd love to hear a bit more from you, Calvin, and perhaps Joshua as well, on your conversations with the artist, and where and how has he kind of brought this idea of dan or blandness into accounts he's given you of his practice. How do we find blandness, or how does he enact blandness in his studio? Is it a state of mind? Is it something that he would describe in the works itself? And how has he described it to you?
Definitely, this is the state of his mind, but it's also the whole process of searching maybe a goal, maybe an answer for himself. He always tried to create a new path for modern paintings in terms of brushstrokes and distinctive artistic language that haven't been seen before. So I would say the whole canvas for Liu Guofu is almost like a race course that he can just keep running non-stop, and that's the to me is very interesting artistic process. For example, when we see the paintings, actually there are tens of layers of oils, although it's very thin and delicate, but then the artist can never stop. He always said, Calvin, can I have one more day or 2 more days, because I still want to paint. And then I asked him, I said, so when do you want to stop? And then he said, I can continue without thinking of finishing it, because the painting can be finished now, but the painting can never be finished. I think that is really magical, because I never seen I never seen artists or like a painting like that, because when we have a subject matter and then we paint it, but then I think he has the subject matter, but then in this subject matter he's actually searching or looking for an answer, but then the answer is really never appear if he want to continue to search. I found that is the very special essence of Liu Guofu's work.
Thank you, Calvin, for directing us back to the artist's personal journal in creating his work. And also I was thinking how we engage with him, because Calvin introduced me to Liu Guofu. I was immediately attracted by his artwork. Then I was talking to him, then he shared his idea why he chose to paint this way. I think there is a value judgment, or there is a trend he wants to develop. Then while we appreciate his work, then we are talking about his value and his individual contribution to the field. And also I think there is ecology is growing, because we recognize the value and we appreciate it. And when we are doing an open discussion to enrich his idea further. I think this is a very meaningful talk today we have to share Liu Guofu's idea and our ideas about his work with wider audience.
Thank you. If anyone does have any more questions, please add them in the chat box. So we still have we can probably go for another 10 minutes or so. But yes, if anyone has anything else, please do share. Sort of leading on from what you were just talking about, can you sort of provide more insight into the techniques and styles that Liu Guofu uses, and to express himself as an artist, and how do you see these compare to those techniques used by other modern Chinese painters?
Liu Guofu's skills, as I said, very personal, and he creates his own kind of signature paintings in terms of the use of material or medium and the brushworks, as well as the subject matter that he wants to suggest on the canvas. I can talk a little bit about the medium. I think this is very fundamental and important. So this is Liu Guofu's paintings, or oil on canvas, right? So from Liu Guofu's painting, we immediately can explore and can examine the oilness against waterness. I think this is something that so unique and never seen before in oil painting, because Liu Guofu tried to apply the principle of ink, just like the principle of Western watercolor. So it's really like water-based, very watery. So water is contributes in a great deal when we see the thin oil of Liu Guofu's canvas, very transparent, very delicate, very easily dried, and allowing the artist to put tens and hundreds of layers of this very thin watery based oil to create the magic. So I think he creates something very special and very flexible for him to continue to demonstrate or show off. The next thing is his brushworks. So because of the principle of ink, so that could also allow the artist to portray the moisture in the air. So now we talk about the yijing, the moisture in the air, like the cloud, the mist, the smoke, and then the rain. So this is very atmospheric, and also
I think it's also very gentle, have the effect of jade. With
exactly. And eventually it delivers the sense of light as well on the canvas. So I found that the use of medium actually gives Liu Guofu a very I would say very unique positioning in the modern painting field. So So what do you think, Joshua and Malcolm? Yeah.
Well, I think if I can respond, Calvin, I think just looking at the backgrounds that you can see on the four of us here, and that kind of latest series of this, the flower series that's behind you, Calvin, it really underscores that liquidity that you were describing. And that sense of using oil to create volume with a technique that, as you point out, is derived from the kind of the dilution of ink and traditional Chinese pigments. By taking that approach, that idea of diluting the pigment down to create a kind of a layering effect, it's definitely kind of lifting something from outside of maybe the conventional ways of using oil painting to create volume and texture. And so that, in that kind of very raw sense, also the visibility of the brushwork that you described was something that really hit home for me when I had the chance to see many more of the works in person at your opening in London a few weeks ago. And having seen a lot of the works that you have on view in St. James's at the moment, only online or in print beforehand, I was really struck by that textural quality that does come across from the brush and that repeated application. But in a way, there's no kind of fetishization of the individual mark. So something that perhaps less from contemporary painters who are perhaps working in other oil media, but certainly when you compare him to some of the other artists who are represented by 3812 or other artists working in ink. I mentioned Liu Dan as part of my kind of comments in the presentation. You know, someone who was also depicting flowers and rocks and taking these literati or scholar subjects and appropriating them or redeploying them in a contemporary idiom. Liu Guofu is doing something very different because we're dealing with layers here, and these layers that are built up through dilution. So this kind of tension and flexibility, this innovation in how his materials are used is one of the things that really struck me about the works when I saw them in person. And as you described, Calvin, that use of dilution to create not just a sense of volume but light. I mean, I can very much, you know, but it doesn't fix a singular fixed vantage point. This isn't a light source. We don't see behind Calvin a singular blossoming flower which is being lit diagonally down from the left. Instead, the light emanates out of the painting rather than seem to kind of be contained within it. So in that sense, I think that ability to kind of create an impact that sort of reaches out of the canvas toward the viewer, it seems to kind of illuminate the space that it's hung within. It's this amazing way that Liu Guofu is integrating, you know, oil, a material that is intrinsically kind of part of the Western canon, the dilution and the brushstrokes that are kind of we can associate with Chinese painting idioms, but uses them to create these works that for us create that emotional impact that we're calling blandness here, or we might find other ways to describe as well. And it's so well illustrated by seeing the works in person and seeing the way that they reach out of the canvas and kind of change the effect of the space around them. So that's my second work on this point.
And also, I found the brushworks of Liu Guofu also demonstrates his skills. All these brushstrokes actually fermented and also abstract, and then layers after layers, and then he actually can project an image. So you could see these artists really like a very skillful in terms of like trying to portray something, but then all these fermented brushstrokes all can come together, and then we can start to really follow the artist to see the image. However, the artist tried to, for example, he draws mountains but no mountains. He draws trees but no tree. So this is so. I mean, this is so poetic, and some viewers also associate his works with the lyrical abstraction by, for example, Zhao Qi. But then he actually, the whole brushworks are totally unique and different. I think it's just he could suggest an abstract image, but then he will also bring us imaginations and then bring us an atmosphere and a state of mind, a state of it's very like emotional and also very spiritual. Yeah.
I think Calvin raised very important ideas, saying the waterness and the oil Liu Guofu managed to put them together. And I think he has overcome the technological conundrum for the medium oil, because if we think about the thinness to dilute the oil, we always use turpentine. Now I can compare his work with Zhang Enli's one. both of them trying to do very thin layer of oil painting. And Zhang Li's way is very different. He reveals the roughness of the canvas, the texture of it, but Liu Guofu is trying to smooth out everything. So he applies thin layer while concentrating on the translucent color and oil to fuse it with, as Calvin says, to give a water capacity, because water is the support of life. So he tried to make the color flow. Meanwhile, I think also something, while comparing Guofu's work with like the abstract expressionist artwork by Mark Roscoe. Mark Roscoe's oil, it doesn't have this kind of light. So it draws you into a kind of a darkness, this kind of sublime. This is the sublimity of Western thinking, while Guofu is trying to make a deeper engagement with the audience, to invite you in, rather than to make you feel tiny, small. You are on the same level of the image. So you can feel how he smooths out your emotion while with very skillful consideration in terms of visual language. I think also Malcolm said very correctly, we need to go to see the real work and then compare those different masterpieces to see Liu Guofu's technological contribution to the field in very new, very unique and contemporary.
Thank you.
Sorry, Kate.
Sorry, Malcolm, go on.
Sure. I just wanted to comment on one last thing there. The way that Joshua described smoothing out the pigments on the surface of the canvas as smoothing out our emotions. And I just wanted to underscore that as something that I appreciate. I don't have a huge amount to add to it, but just, you know, the way that going back into how images have been read, that convention of how we read, you know, the dynamic movement of a line as carrying the movement of the figure that it depicts. This parallel between kind of bodily movements and bodily states is kind of intrinsic to how we read an image. You know, dynamism, brushwork, and kinetic energy that transfers from the artist's hand into the surface, and then we read that as the image behaving in a way that kind of parallels how the artist's hand moves. But I absolutely love and haven't really given as much thought as I perhaps could have done before to the idea of the emotional impact of a technique in that way, rather than the parallel between a kind of a bodily movement and a bodily movement, an emotional state of the artist that somehow is dilute and even and smooth, that then translates into the smoothness of our own emotions, smoothing down the kind of the equanimity that we can access through these works, again by seeing them in person, the best way to do it. And that's really all I wanted to finish on, to kind of to underscore that point Joshua had made, and again to wish that I thought of that one as with his first comment as well. So over to you, Kate.
I just wanted to say thank you to you all for your contribution. It's been amazing. Thank you very much. I hope all of the participants have enjoyed it. I would encourage all of you, as Joshua and Malcolm have stated, to come and visit the gallery and see the works in person, because they really do. They really are stunning. So yes, do come and see us. You are very welcome. And thank you very much all again for joining us today. And we hope to see you very soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.